Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Ransomware, What to Do If Disaster Strikes. This webinar is brought to you by MSP360 as well as Emsisoft. I am pleased to be joined by Fabian Wosar, who's the CTO at Emsisoft. I am Doug Hazelman. Brief introduction here about myself. I am the VP of Technical Marketing here at MSP360, which was formerly Cloudberry. And when I look at kind of some of my achievements in life, and this is something that Fabian's going to go through too for his own life, but you know, I came up with a couple of things. First off is I have been impeached. I was impeached as the junior class president in high school. I'm not going to go into the full story, but it was one of those things that, you know, kids being kids, so to speak. Next up, I used to travel a lot, and I achieved the highest unpublished awards tier on Delta Airlines. You know how they have silver, gold, platinum. I was 360, which is the highest tier. I achieved that, and then of course I was so sick of traveling, I basically didn't travel much anymore. And finally, you may have heard my voice or seen my face. I am the host of MSP Voice. It's a podcast that specializes in talking to MSPs about their businesses. 70 episodes. Episode 70 just dropped today. If you want to learn more, mspvoice.com. So Fabian, I know a lot of people are here to listen to you and hear what you have to say. So let's hear a little bit about you.
Yeah, so my name is Fabian. Well, technically Fabian, but I kind of adopted the English pronunciation at this point. I'm the CTO at Emsisoft, which is an antivirus or anti-malware vendor located in New Zealand. So my three biggest achievements in life are pretty much, I got thrown out of Windsor Castle once because I was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Why the fuck not" on it. I also recently rescued two adorable cats who fortunately won't make an appearance this time because I kind of locked them out of the office. And yeah, the last point is that the work of my team and I has cost ransomware groups over $1 billion in the last 7 years. So you can say that most ransomware authors don't particularly like me. And
so let's see some examples.
Yeah, the slides are stuck. Ah, there you go. Technical difficulties, I guess. So, what are we going to talk about first? Well, first we are going to talk about what you should do if you or your clients are hit by ransomware, because there are a couple of things that are a little bit counterintuitive at times. So the first thing you should absolutely do is you should try to find and isolate the affected systems on your network, and you should completely disconnect them from your network. You can either pull the plug, or you can change the Wi-Fi password, so to say. You can use like the configuration of your router or switch or whatever you use to kind of lock them out. But it's important, well, this is mostly important because like a lot of ransomware nowadays, the vast majority actually, they will try to scan your network and try to encrypt files that are stored on like network shares. They will try to spread to other systems that they can reach on the network, things like that. So isolating the infected clients on your networks, like your first and utmost priority. Now, the next thing you should do is kind of secure your backups. Now, ransomware nowadays will specifically target your backups and try to make it unusable. They may try to encrypt your backups. They may try to overwrite or just delete your backups. So securing your backups, especially if they are reachable from like your client systems, which is something that isn't ideal, but we will talk about that a little bit later. Try to kind of secure backups. And this may mean in some cases to just also disconnect your backup system or like your backup storage from your network. Now, yes, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say also, you know, there's the idea of disconnected, right? And I know tape is one of the best ways to keep your backups disconnected. But then cloud is sort of another way to have your backups somewhat disconnected, not necessarily, it's because it's not on the same physical network, but storing your backups in the cloud can be another way to get them off site and have them pseudo disconnected as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, another thing is to disable like any maintenance tasks that may run on the affected systems. Some of you may have like maintenance tasks to clean out temporary files or to rotate log files, stuff like that. The reason for doing this is that a lot of these kind of files, logs, temporary files may give you hints how the original attack took place and how ransomware was able to infect the system in question to begin with. Another reason is that a lot of ransomware is actually kind of shoddily programmed. So they may actually store important files like the encryption key inside your temporary files. So if you just clean them out, then the key is gone, and yeah, you're kind of screwed at that point. Now, the next thing you should do is create backups or images of all the infected systems. And you may kind of wonder why it would make sense to create backups of encrypted or infected systems. And the reason for that is quite simple. A lot of ransomware has bugs, and not only the ransomware has bugs, also the ransomware decryptor have bugs. One recent example is Ryuk. So Ryuk is one of the most prolific ransomware families out there right now, right? And they target companies specifically. And the Ryuk decryptor, for example, due to a recent bug that was introduced with one of the updates that the Ryuk people released for their ransomware, actually ended up truncating files. And essentially like 1 byte is lost at the moment for every Ryuk encrypted files that is decrypted by the Ryuk decryptor. Now, 1 byte may not sound too bad, especially if it's like at the very end. I mean, for most file formats, it's probably just like a Slack byte, for example, right? That was introduced by padding files towards certain file sizes. Now, the problem is that that is the case for most file formats, but it isn't for all. And especially it isn't true for VHD files or VHDX files, like virtual hard disk files for used by Hyper-V, for example. It's also not true for a lot of database files like Oracle and MySQL. And those are usually the kind of files that are most important to you, right? So having a backup of all your encrypted files or of your encrypted systems is generally a very good idea, because if something happens, you can still roll back and try again to decrypt them, or consult with a company like us, for example, and get like a fixed decryptor for the ransomware that you got hit by. So the next step is to quarantine the malware. And before you quarantine it, if the malware is still running, it may also make sense to create like a full memory dump of any malicious processes that are still running. The reason for that is that sometimes the memory dump may still contain like the key material that was used to encrypt your files. So so it would be possible to decrypt your files without paying the ransom. The most important thing is, like the emphasis is on quarantining though. Don't just outright remove or don't just outright delete or even reformat or re-image your systems. The reason for that is that we actually, for a company like Emsisoft, to be able to help you, we actually have to reverse engineer and like take a look at the exact malware that you got hit by. Now, the problem is if you remove the entire infection, finding the exact sample that was used to encrypt all your files becomes extremely difficult. It's kind of like trying to find very specific and exact needle inside like a huge stack of other needles. It would be easy if it was like a needle in a stack of hay, right? Because then the needle would stick out. But the reality is we get about like probably over 1 million new malware files every single day, and finding like the one exact file that is responsible for your infection becomes like an absolute nightmare. So quarantine is fine. disabling it somehow using like group policies or execution restriction is fine as well. But don't just outright remove, don't just outright delete or stuff like that. Now, it's also important to kind of try and figure out who or what was like the patient zero, like how did they get access to the system, or how to, like how did they get in? What other things did they do while they were on my network? And this is like a broad field of like digital forensics, right? And there are like a lot of companies out there who provide services in that field. If you don't know how to do it, or if you don't have like proper logs available, then it's probably better to consult with a company that kind of specializes in digital forensics.
Well, it can also be difficult too, depending on when they actually planted the malware before they activated it.
Especially when it comes to like enterprises and MSPs, ransomware authors usually have had access to your network and to your systems for at least a week before the actual attack happened.
Okay.
So they do a lot of reconnaissance. They will try to figure out exactly like what are like the juicy systems, what are like the most juiciest documents and files in your network that they should hit first. Stuff like that. So they have been in there for like a very long time in many cases, usually weeks, sometimes even months. So trying to track back like how exactly did they originally gain access to my system can be like very difficult. So now the next thing is you also kind of need to figure out what ransomware you got hit by. And there are services like ID Ransomware out there, for example, which are very helpful in them. Essentially, you just upload an encrypted file and the ransom note that like the criminals left behind on your system. And then you upload it. It does its kind of magic. It usually tries to match like Bitcoin addresses, email addresses, contact details, file extensions, certain file markers, all kinds of different meta information, and then spits out like hopefully the ransomware family that you got hit by. And like as an added bonus, it will also tell you if there are like any free fixes available. Like Emsisoft, for example, we released decryptors for more than 100 ransomware families out there that are able to, so if you got hit by any of those, then you can just recover your files for free, pretty much. Now, the last thing is obvious that in some cases, you may be tempted to pay the ransom, but keep in mind that paying the ransom should always be like the last option you take. And there are like many reasons for it. The first and foremost reason is ultimately that like in about 1 in 20 cases, the ransomware author will just grab your money and you will never hear from him again or from them again. The other one is obviously that you don't really have any idea where the money goes to. You have ransomware campaigns like SamSam, for example, where the money just disappears in either Iran or Syria. So your ransom may very well fund terrorism, literally. So paying the ransom should only be considered as an option if the alternative is pretty much that your entire company will go up, right? Go belly up, sorry. So there are a couple of things that you should avoid doing when you got hit by ransomware. Now, the first thing is try not to reboot or restart your devices. There are some ransomware families out there who will actually penalize you for it. A lot of ransomware will actually render your entire Windows installation unbootable, so the system would never boot up again, which can cause other kinds of issues. Also, and that is actually a mistake that happens quite a bit, do not connect any external storage devices or any network storage devices back to either an infected system or to a network that an infected system still has access to. I have seen so many cases where people had backups on like an external hard disk, for example, and they saw they have ransomware. They just thought, hey, I don't see ransomware running on my system anymore, right? And they just connected their external drive to restore their backups. They missed that the ransomware was actually still running, and the external storage was just encrypted as well. So do not connect any external storage devices or any network storage devices or anything to any infected systems. Yeah, pretty much.
So, but just real quick though, in terms of, if you mentioned earlier to create a backup of an infected system. So in that case, I would say just bring in a fresh, like, external hard drive to do the
pretty
backup.
much, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
pretty
not
much.
something with data on it, so that way you can at least get the
No,
backup and
no.
get the image. So
I mean, for enterprises, to be honest, like most of them, they probably won't do like backups on external storage anyway.
yeah.
They will probably do it via NAS, so using like a cloud solution, right, like yours. But like especially home users, they often do this, and it always pains me to hear that like a home user did the right thing and then suddenly they just plugged it in and everything was gone, right?
Yeah.
So it's always a pity. You also shouldn't pay the ransom immediately, and this is quite important. A lot of ransomware incident response companies and like data recovery companies, for them, paying the ransom kind of became the default over time, which is actually quite a sad development. But in a lot of cases, you don't have to pay the ransom. You always have options, and you should explore all options before you actually decide to pay a ransom. So don't just pay the ransom immediately. Also, don't delete files unless like someone told you it's fine to delete them. This goes back towards the thing that ransomware may store encryption keys or encrypted keys in those files, and without those files, their decryptor won't work. This also applies, by the way, to ransom nodes. One ransomware family in particular, which is called BitPaymer, DoppelPaymer, or IronCrypt, they actually create a ransom node for every single file that they encrypted. And in that ransom node is the encoded and encrypted key that you need to decrypt the file that was encrypted, right? So if you remove like all the ransom nodes, for example, then you can no longer decrypt any of your files. So do not delete anything, pretty much. And yeah, also do not trust ransomware authors. That includes, do not trust just because the ransomware said it's Ryuk, that it's actually Ryuk. Use ID ransomware to make sure it is, right? But it also, don't trust that just because you paint them, you will actually get your data back. As I mentioned before, in about like 1 in 20 cases, they will just run and you will never hear them again. But even if you get back a decryptor, the decryptor may be faulty, like in Ryuk, for example, so it may damage your data. There have also been a lot of ransomware cases where the ransomware itself is actually buggy and just destroys your data. So even if you paid the ransom and they gave you like the encryption keys due to bugs in the ransomware, you can never recover your files. So do not trust ransomware authors.
Yeah, I would imagine once they get their money, they don't really have a whole lot of incentive to make sure that you're back up and running. They got their money. That was what they're after.
there's also like this notion that there's like honor among thieves, right? And that ransomware is actually a business of trust, and that they need to give you your files back because otherwise they will get like bad reviews and nobody else will ever pay them again. But the reality, ransomware is more a business of hope, right? Mm-hmm. You just exploit the desperation of people because they have the hope to get their files back and their business back in order. You don't necessarily really care about, you don't really care if there's like any danger. Recently, I had a case where someone got hit by a ransomware family, where we know that about like 90% of all the cases that paid, they don't get like the files back. But victims don't hear that. They hear, oh, there's a 10% chance I will get them back, and not there's a 90% chance you will use your file and and the hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars you just paid in a ransom, right? So it's very much a business of hope, really. So let's talk about what you can do to make sure that this doesn't happen, or that this doesn't happen again. And I have like very bad news for you, especially if you're an MSP. So if you as an MSP get hit by ransomware, you can expect to pay at least 7 figures to get the data of like all your clients back. It kind of depends how many systems you manage and like how many clients you are responsible for, but you can. So recently we had a case with like REvil, which is like a ransomware group that very much specializes in targeting MSPs. And in that particular case, that MSP was responsible for managing about like 1,800 endpoints, and the ransom turned out to be about 5 million. So that gives you like an idea. The other bad news is that pretty much all the MSP cases we were involved in, they pretty much lose about 70% of their entire client base overnight, because it's at least in the eyes of their clients, the MSP is responsible for the systems, and like they are the reason why all their systems are now encrypted. So they will just go for someone else. So the bottom line is there's absolutely no again here, right? If this happens to you, most likely you're done, like your business is over. So do not let this happen to you. So let's fix that. Let's fix that small mistake, and yeah, let's scratch off that again. So how can you make sure this doesn't happen to you? Now, obviously, there are the basics, right? Credential hygiene, limit remote access, either only have remote access available through VPN or from certain networks, for example. Practice least privilege principle, meaning don't run around with like admin accounts everywhere. This, by the way, also applies to like API keys and stuff like that for your different integrations. Use different API keys for different integrations, and try to limit the API keys to only the bits that are absolutely necessary. Regular employee trainings are important. Like make sure that your employees know how to deal with like email attachments in particular. Make multi-factor authentication mandatory. Whenever there's like an option to have multi-factor authentication, always enable it. Also try to segregate your network as much as possible. So if, for example, the system of like your secretary gets infected by something like Emotet or TrickBot, which is usually like the first stage for a Ryuk attack, it would be great if like your secretary doesn't necessarily have access to the network of like your developers, for example, right? So yeah, those are like the basics. If you have to have remote access or RDP or anything, as I mentioned before, make sure remote access is only available via certain networks or via VPN, for example, and that the VPN has multi-factor authentication enabled as well. Now, I know that for a lot of companies, it's kind of trendy to have like bring your own device as kind of almost what's the right word? Almost as like a benefit of the job, right? Oh yeah, you can bring like your own phone and you can use your own laptop and it's all great. But in reality, it's an absolute security nightmare. So avoid doing it if at all possible. I mean, mobile devices are kind of okay, but especially when it comes to like laptops and Windows laptops and stuff like that, and they can just plug it in at their workplace. And in reality, you can never like restrict and monitor like the system of an employee, like a private system of an employee, as strictly as you can do with like hardware that your company owns. Not to mention, this also applies to like if you're an MSP and you log in to like your neat little dashboard from like your family computer, where like your son or your daughter that that your children use as well, for example. So yeah, bring your own device is like an absolute security nightmare, and try to have like dedicated hardware and dedicated devices for all your different tasks.
And I would imagine, especially in for regulated customers, if they're in Medicare or financial or whatever, that would be even more important.
Oh yeah, but there it's like those are so heavily regulated. Then like bring your own device isn't even an option there. So
Yeah.
it's more like MSP businesses as well as like normal technology businesses. I mean, nowadays you have a lot of technology companies compete when it comes to like getting the best talent, and then like stuff like bring your own device for some reason is like a benefit to some of them, and they try to use these kinds of policies to attract like more talent. So, but from a security point of view, it's like absolutely horrible. Now, the next thing is PowerShell. Now, my advice to PowerShell is just uninstall it. In some cases, it's not necessarily possible to just uninstall it. In those cases, at least like monitor it very, very closely. Like you should be aware of like every single PowerScript and any kind of PowerScript command that is running on your clients, because PowerShell is probably the #1 tool that ransomware gangs will use in order to kind of move within your network laterally. That means they get like a foothold on like one system, and then they often use PowerShell, like a whole bunch of PowerShell attack frameworks almost, to then from there move to like other systems on your network. So if you can remove PowerShell, that's great. Just uninstall it, and you will be, yeah, like a whole bunch of malware will no longer be a threat to you. And in those cases where you can't uninstall it, just monitor it very, very closely. And like the last bit is to maybe consider cybersecurity insurance, right? Especially if you're an MSP. As an MSP, you kind of are responsible for other people's data. So having insurance coverage in case something goes wrong or something happens might be a good idea. And there are like some cyber insurances out there who kind of try to push towards paying ransoms, and there are others out there who don't. So try to talk to like the insurer in question and see what their policies are. So I think that's probably something you would like to talk about.
Sure.
Yeah.
We've mentioned it a couple of times. We mentioned it a couple of times in terms of backup. Obviously backup is going to be key to this, and the most important thing is to have multiple copies of your backup, of your data, or of your backups. And you've probably all heard it before, the 3-2-1 rule, but I talk about it all the time because it is so important. And it's the idea of you have 3 copies of your data, 2 different mediums, one of them off-site. So you've got your primary data, a backup, and a backup of the backup. And one of those is off-site. And the cloud does work for off-site. It's not, again, hardly anything is foolproof these days in terms of what these bad actors are trying to do. But at least with cloud, it's not a normal connection. You're probably not going to be able to get to it through PowerShell and those types of things. But what you also want to look at doing is on your cloud provider is make sure that you have versioning enabled. Because if someone does get in there and is able to delete a backup that's stored in the cloud, if you have versioning, at least it will be held there for a period of time, depending on your cloud provider. So that's something you definitely want to look into. And just like everything else, two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication is a must. And don't share the logins. Everyone has a unique login, because as soon as you share it once, then it gets shared out again, then everybody has it. And guess what? The ransomware guys get it. They log into your RMM, and then they run amok across all of your customers. So be very, very careful about that. RMM is probably one of the biggest things that you need to lock down, because if you think of it from a control point, you've got access into all of your customer systems through your monitoring and management. So that should be locked down as tight as you can get it. and the backup software as well. Keep that backup software locked down, whether it's a backup server on site or in the case of Cloudberry, where it's a software as a service solution. Make sure that you limit very much the access to that control panel so that only very few people have access to it. And, you know, as Fabian mentioned earlier, use different keys for different customers in terms of API access and those types of things. Don't use the same key across all your customers, because then if one customer gets hit, then it's possible that then the ransomware guys have access through API to all of your customers' backups. So unique for every customer is very, very much encouraged. Testing, right? A backup is only good if it actually works and if you can recover from it. So definitely test your backups or test the recoverability of your backups, whether, you know, you just try to recover an individual file, or, you know, you do whole system recoveries on a time-to-time basis. It's something that a lot of people kind of don't do, that they set the backup up and they're like, okay, it's good, hopefully I'll never need it. But then when they do need it, they discover that there's an issue, whether it's the backup vendor or the configuration or whatever, and they can't recover, and now your backups are no good. So you've been doing all of that for a long period of time probably, and it's no good. So definitely test that. And it's not just the backups, it's also your procedures. You know, one of the things that I've been thinking about as Fabian's been going through what to do and what not to do is, I can just imagine how panicked you're going to be if you get hit by ransomware. Everything that we've already gone through that has all these things to do, not to do, that's going to go right out of your head. And you're just going to be in full-on panic mode, especially if you're an MSP and you've got 5, 6, 10 customers that have been hit, to be able to remember all this stuff. So it's all about procedure as well. So not just test your backups, but understand, hey, let's do a ransomware drill. And if something happens, you know, we isolate, you know, we back up all those things that Fabian was talking about. Create a checklist and make sure that that you and all of your techs know what to do in the event that someone gets hit by ransomware. And then of course, don't allow backups to be hard deleted by anyone, including you. That gets back to this idea of versioning. So, you know, if you're storing your backups in the cloud, you know, make sure that you have versioning enabled. That will protect you on a certain level. And, you know, it's generally a good idea to let the backup software itself control deletes as part of the retention policy. Because if you go in and you delete a file that's part of a backup chain, now you've just destroyed that entire backup chain. And if you can't get it back, guess what? That whole backup chain is no good. And you may have just lost a month or a week or whatever's worth of backups that are unrecoverable. So that's very, very important, is don't hard delete, don't go in and start playing around in the backup files, whether they're on site or in the cloud. Only do it through the backup software itself.
Yeah, now some of you may have noticed in the news, like a very recent trend, that ransomware authors and ransomware gangs not only started to encrypt the files, but also to download it, and if you don't pay, to publish it. Like Maze is like a very recent example who started doing it. Now there's a second gang who already kind of announced that they are going to do the same. That is REvil, which again is like that very specific ransomware group that tries to target MSPs specifically. So just imagine your RMM being used to not only like encrypt all your clients' files, but also to first download all your clients' files and then use those as kind of bargaining chip for you to pay the ransom, right? So, yeah. And also keep in mind that like all of this is kind of general advice. Your setup environment and like your situations and your companies are probably quite unique, and you may have to tweak them slightly. You may need like additional parameters to secure your data depending on any regulatory requirements that your certain kind of business has, for example. So, but in general, if you follow these kind of practices and apply it to your business particularly, or to your client base in particular, then you will be quite well prepared when ransomware hits. And as Doug mentioned, it's probably a good idea to have like kind of an exercise or like a drill to test out how your policies work, and then your employees get used to these kinds of policies and procedures that you put in place.
Yeah, I can imagine the worst time to figure out what to do when you've been hit by ransomware is when you don't even.
When you get hit by ransomware.
Is when you get hit by it and you've never thought about it. You're like, oh, this happens to other people, it doesn't happen to me, and all of a sudden it happens to you, and you're not prepared. So preparation is key in many things in life, especially here.
So that brings us to the Q&A portion.
Awesome. So I don't have any open questions right now, but I'm sure people out there have questions. This is a great time. We have Fabian here. He knows this stuff. Like he said, he's cost the ransomware industry over $1 billion. They do not like him for that reason. And that's because he's good at what he does. So if you have questions, please pop it into the Q&A. We're going to stick around here for quite a while to answer these questions, and hopefully, we'll be able to help you out in any way that we possibly can. I've answered a few just in terms of recording. So this is being recorded. We will have, after this is completed, we'll send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with access to the recording. We'll make a PDF version of the slides available as well as part of that. So that way you can see the slides, especially, as we talked about some of this checklist items, you can use that to kind of create your checklist. Fabian, Bill has a question in terms of what about decryption options? You mentioned that there are some decryptors out there. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, essentially, the only way to decrypt files is if the ransomware author made a mistake, right? If they implemented their cryptographic scheme properly, there's like no way for someone like me to figure out a way how to get the files back. That's just like the reality. And that is the reason why backups are so important, because you can't always rely on the stupidity of ransomware authors in order to recover your files.
Okay, and another one from Dan is, and I don't know if you have these or if this is even available in terms of percentages of ransom that get paid, but then don't get decrypted. I know you mentioned it sometimes, you can't trust these guys. Are there any industry statistics on how many times a ransom's been paid?
So Coveware, for example, releases reports quite a bit. And to be honest, it kind of depends on the exact ransomware family that you got hit by. There are gangs out there like Ryuk or REvil, and those are like very well organized with like a lot of people working in these campaigns. And paying the ransom there will most likely get you back your data, and they will give you the decryptor to decrypt your data, right? Other campaigns like Phobos in particular, or like Dharma, those are ransomware that is usually just sold on the black market to like individuals. And those are like the kind of campaigns where you need to be very careful, because those are usually the ones that just take the money and run.
Yeah. Okay.
And on average, it's about like so if you ignore like the families and you just take the data, then it's about like 1 in 20 chance that they will just take the money and run. And like in the other cases, you will get at least something, right?
Okay.
Whether or not it's working is like a completely different story. But you will at least get back something.
Yeah. I'm not sure if Mohammed has a question here. I'm not sure if I understand it. It says, is there any case where paying the ransomware creator that get decrypted?
I'm not sure.
I'm not quite sure what that means. Mohammed, if you could maybe try that one, rephrase it, would be great. Got another one here, cloud backups with active protection and agents. Do you trust these apps? So I know backup software, some backup software does have ransomware detection. I know typically it kind of it relies on heuristics and files being changed outside of the norm of a normal backup schedule and some of these things. Fabian, what has been your experience with backup software that tries to detect ransomware?
So this does not only apply to like backup software, but like all kinds of security software. You have to keep in mind, in most cases, the ransomware authors had access to those systems for probably a week in advance, sometimes
Okay.
more. All they will do is just turn it off, right? Before they run their ransomware, they will just turn it off. So security software won't necessarily help you. And this is also true with like these kind of protection features that some of the backup, that some of the backup vendors implemented for their backup solution. So try not to rely on those. I mean, they're kind of neat and they make for nice USPs, right? But in the end of the day, you have to keep in mind, if you can turn it off, and you can turn it off, then a ransomware author can as well. So
yeah, and it's probably it's good to have more than one kind of detection or remediation in place, right? Just in case. I would, don't just rely on backup software to detect your ransomware, because it might get in, like you said, and get disabled. So you want to have other ways of doing it as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Think of it more as like one additional layer in your like layered security approach, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to rely on just like one layer. You just put them on top of each other and then hope that nothing gets through like all layers, right?
Yep. So another question here, should Windows volume shadow copy be turned on in services by default?
Now the problem is, I mean, personally, I would say yes, because it can save your bacon in a couple of cases. But like one of the very first things that ransomware will do is like completely delete like all your shadow copies. So it's more of a thing. It's convenient and it can help sometimes, but we are back to this kind of layer approach, right? Just like one another layer, and sometimes it saves you, but in like the vast majority of cases, it probably won't. No.
Okay. Another one. Excuse me. Another question from Anonymous. Is there any info about ransomware attacking other OSs other than Windows?
Oh yeah, there are quite a few actually.
Okay.
Linux in particular is quite heavily targeted, although those are not like the same kind of ransomware threats that you will find on like a Windows network, obviously, right?
Okay.
But yeah, Linux servers are very much targets for ransomware gangs these days. They also try to target not OSs specifically, but certain services or like servers. Like there was a time where MongoDB was under heavy attack. So they were looking up MongoDB instances that didn't have like any sort of authentication enabled, and then they just encrypted all the data stored in those MongoDB instances. Same is true for Redis, for example. So yeah, don't think just because you're using Linux or something that is not Windows, you're safe from ransomware, because you aren't.
Okay. Next one, not a question, just a plug for Emsisoft. Aaron says he sells Emsisoft to all of his clients and he's bored. I'm guessing because none of his clients get hit by ransomware.
that. Honestly, that's actually not the first time I thought. So yeah. Thank you for the compliments, Aaron.
So I'm not sure if I understand this question either, but is it true a ransomware company first sends malware to attack? I mean, or they have different attack vectors, I'm guessing.
Yes, they do. So there are certain ransomware families like Ryuk, for example. Ryuk usually comes as what we call a secondary infection, meaning there was like some other malware in your network first.
Okay.
Malware detected that you have like lots of data in your network. So ransomware would be a great idea. And then they deploy the ransomware. So Ryuk is like is like one big one. They use usually Ryuk infection are preceded by infections with Emotet and TrickBot. Now all the BitPaymer, DoppelPaymer, and IronCrypt, those ransomware attacks are usually preceded by infections with Dridex. Now, but that doesn't mean like that like every single ransomware like has like a preceding infection, right? The vast majority of all compromises are usually through unsecured RDP, like user credentials that are being leaked. Also, in quite a lot of cases, insecure RMM software. So people didn't update their RMM software. So they're like open vulnerabilities or unpatched vulnerabilities within their server software, right?
Yeah,
Windows.
it seems like RMM and remote control
Yeah.
are some of the, especially on the MSP side, or two of the
Yes.
most. Yeah. So Mohammed revised his question. So I think what he's saying is, can he trust the ransom person to send a decryptor software if other options fail to be followed from your experience? And I think you said about 1 in 20, even if you do pay the ransom, they send it, or they, you know, they won't even send it.
Yeah,
Once they have the
and
money.
like in those other cases, and like the other 95%, they send something back.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not that works is like a different question. It kind of depends on like the exact ransomware family. There are like ransomware families out there, as I mentioned before, that will damage your data. So even if you have like the decryptor, I mean, you can decrypt something, but what you will get out of it won't be the files. That you started out with, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of difficult, and it very much depends on like the different cases. And that is also kind of the reason why it may make sense for you to approach a company like Coveware, for example, who specializes in the incident response, because they know the different groups, they know like how likely it will be to get a reply or get a decent decryptor, and they usually also are aware of like how well do the decryptor work that you get back, right?
Okay.
An additional benefit is also that like Coveware works quite closely with us, so you also get like our experience as well if you go through them. So
cool. So I have there's I'm going to combine 3 questions into one. They're all about Emsisoft. So 1, does Emsisoft stop ransomware? 2, can it run in parallel with other security software? And 3, what distinguishes Emsisoft from other software?
So yes, we do stop ransomware. We are actually quite good at it. I don't think there has been like a single Emsisoft customer who had Emsisoft running at the time of infection and who didn't like play around with the settings or like allowed the ransomware to run with an Emsisoft that ever got like infected by ransomware and got their files encrypted. So we're actually quite proud of that as well. So can it run in parallel with other security software? It kind of can, but we don't recommend it. Usually when you have like different security softwares, they tend to kind of get in each other's ways. So it may work in your case, but it's not like a scenario that we would officially support or even recommend.
Okay.
Now, what distinguishes us from other software? Well, we take there are like a lot of different things. Well, first of all, we actually take the privacy of our users very, very serious, meaning we don't have like a permanent telemetry stream in the background or like even upload your files to like the cloud somewhere, as like a lot of our competitors do. The other one is that we very, very much emphasize like customer support. We are extremely customer focused. You will never have to talk to like a robot or anything when you contact our customer support, right? And we're actually quite proud of that as well. And anyone who ever contacted the Emsisoft support will probably like confirm that like our customer support is like one of the best out there. The other thing is that we have like a very focused approach when it comes to protecting your systems. We try to stay away from adding like a lot of bloat to our software, or like adding features that quite frankly have no place in a security software to begin with. Like, why do you need like a tune-up utility in your antivirus, right? Or why do you need like a VPN in your antivirus? It's we are quite a small team, so we need very much to focus on like our core competencies, and that's what we do, and that's what we do best pretty much. So those are probably like the 3 biggest differentiators between us and like a company like Kaspersky, for example, or like Norton, like you said, right?
Okay. So Jerry has a question, and you kind of touched on this during the presentation. The question is, are there any active ransomware that modify the MBR, the master boot record? And you kind of mentioned that when you said don't restart, because if you restart, it may not boot. Is that because that's what they're doing?
Yeah, so there's like Petya is like the big one, for example. What they will do is they will overwrite your master boot records. So the next time you boot, that is actually only when they start encrypting the data on your disks. It's not like when the malware runs, but like on your next reboot. So
Okay.
yes, there are ones. They are kind of rare, or because, well, first of all, a lot of systems kind of moved away from using the MBR to begin with to boot systems. I mean, most of us will have like UEFI systems, and there the MBR isn't really a thing in the boot process, right?
Okay.
Because you boot through UEFI.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yes, they are still there and they're still out there, but they are somewhat rare.
Okay. And what if I want to play with ransomware? Next question from Jonas is there a tool to simulate a ransomware attack for academic purposes? And if so, can you recommend one?
I think there's like a ransomware simulator from known for B, I think. But you have to keep in mind that, especially if you want to test like security solutions, again, like simulated ransomware, that depending on what exactly the security solution is looking for, it may fail these kinds of simulated tests.
Okay.
What would probably be a better approach would be to set up like a completely isolated system and like use actual ransomware. And you can find it quite easily. There are like a lot of GitHub repositories, for example, that have like malware collections and stuff like that you could use.
Okay.
Personally, we as a company, we don't focus much on like these kinds of synthetic tests because we only care about like real life performance and like against actual ransomware, and we don't really care much about these synthetic tests. But yeah, they are out there. There are like a couple of them, but if I were to make like a decision for like my company of which kind of software to use, I would probably set up like an isolated systems and use like actual ransomware that is out there to test it.
And then, I know another thing is education, right?
Oh, yeah,
and that's a big part. And there's a lot of companies out there that do that, especially if you're an MSP, to make sure that your clients are educated, to know how to spot, spoofing and not to click on links and, all these other types of things. I know there's a lot of educational resources out there.
Yeah, there are.
Okay. So the next question from Dan is, do you have protection for NAS? He says specifically Synology and QNAP. I don't know if that's for me or if that's for you, or we can both answer it.
We don't, but you might, because like NAS is like very much like a backup kind of thing. So
yeah, I mean, we support NAS in terms of being able to back up from NAS or to NAS. We treat it. We can definitely back it up, but I don't know if there's, because I know like Synology and QNAP, they have they have a Linux operating system on them, right, as to control. But I wasn't sure if he's asking if you have anything that you can install on that to make it within that to make sure that it doesn't happen. Yeah,
no, we don't.
Okay. And I know, and from MSP360, we used to have an agent that would run inside of that NAS operating system, but it just got to be too much of a support nightmare because they would constantly change things, or the customer would update and wouldn't update, and it just became way too difficult to maintain it for the small number of users that were using it, in terms of keeping up to date with their operating system, or the customers not keeping up to date with the latest updates in the NAS operating system. Cool. Well, we are close to the top of the hour. Oh, here's another one. So, and Dan says, because use NAS as file server, there have been ransoms that attack the OSs in the NAS.
There have been.
Okay.
What was the name again? I think it was Megalocker, for example, who specifically kind of targeted NAS that were accessible through the internet and then just like encrypt all of them. So, and it's like, yeah, the best thing I would suggest is just have like a backup of your NAS, right? Just backup your NAS, just as you would any other system. So
you don't, does Emsisoft think that you'll ever support NAS, or?
I mean, never say never, right?
Yeah.
But it's not on like our
it's not on your short-term roadmap.
Yeah. At the moment.
Another fun question. How long will Emsisoft work on Windows 7?
Yeah, we actually recently talked about it, and like our approach to this is usually once the once like the usage among our customers falls below a certain threshold, we will announce that we will stop supporting it usually within like a year or so. That's how we that's how we did it with like Windows XP. And once like it becomes kind of once it becomes like obvious, or like once it crystallizes that we will have to drop support for Windows 7 soon, because like it doesn't make sense for us to continue it further, we will do the same for like Windows 7. So at least for the time being, we will continue to support it. And if we ever decide to stop supporting it, we will give you like we will give an announcement to like all our customers and make sure that they are aware of it way ahead of time, so they have either time to update their systems or to move like a different solution that will support Windows 7 more long term.
Yeah, because that works so well for Microsoft to let everybody know when they're getting in support for something, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know. Like we supported Windows XP, for example, I think like almost 2 years after Windows, like after Microsoft stopped supporting it. So,
And it's still running out there. So.
Oh yeah, it is. Like, it is. Like I don't know how or why, but it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is back to the NAS from Anonymous asking about MSP360. If we'll support NAS, like I said, we had supported it previously. We kind of ended that support because it was very, very difficult from a lot of aspects. Whether or not we'll do it again, it remains to be seen. But if it's a huge request, go up onto our forums and ask about it. That's one of the best ways to to talk to our product managers and ask them those types of questions. So let's see. How much ransomware is initiated via phishing as opposed to other methods?
That's like very difficult to say, because reporting of ransomware incidents in particular isn't well regulated. Like a lot of companies don't really want to admit that they got hit by ransomware. So it becomes difficult to track, but it's definitely so like phishing and deployment of ransomware through Emotet and like Dridex, which are like the main kind of malware strains that spread through phishing, is like one of the top three infection vectors, like besides RDP and like remote access.
Okay.
Stuff, and vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities, phishing, and RDP or other forms of remote access are like the top three infection vectors.
Okay. So Jeremy asked, what other training resources could you recommend? I know they exist in terms of training, especially for end customers. I don't have any off the top of my head. I have to Google it myself. But Fabian, I don't know if there's any kind of training, especially for end users, that you would recommend. Or
training is difficult. There are obviously like a lot of resources and like sources for information. Like we have quite a few interesting information in our blog, for example, and I'm sure the same will be true for you. But that isn't like exactly training, right? It's more like keeping on top of information and like knowing what like the latest infection vectors are and stuff like that. So
yeah, and I do know, like MSP360, we actually have posters and pamphlets that you can brand yourself and hang up at your customer sites and those types of things. So check, like you said, check the blogs for both MSP360 as well as Emsisoft, and there's some resources there. Jose wants to know, what are symptoms when ransomware or malware starts? So basically for early detection, how can it be controlled?
So for ransomware, obviously it's like high CPU and high IO load, because they literally read every single file on your system and like encrypt it and then write a single file on your system again. The same is obviously true for like network traffic. Since ransomware will usually also encrypt all the files that are stored on like your network shares, for example. General things like new processes running, right? That you don't immediately recognize, new auto starts, especially for that's especially true for malware, like new scheduled tasks, for example, that pop out of nowhere, new auto runs in general, like heavy activity of PowerShell. So if like a lot of PowerShell calls occur in like a very short time, that's usually like a good indicator that something's going on. So
Okay.
there are a few.
But basically be protected from the start, right?
Yes, pretty much. Like the best way to protect yourself is to not get infected to begin with, right?
Yeah. So Linda has a couple things. First, Linda says know before, which is KNOWBE, and then the number 4. They have end user training, so Linda did point that out. But then has another question.
They are also the ones who have like a simulation suite for ransomware available.
Yeah. And then, but there's another question about malvertising, and asking is malvertising a vector?
It still is kind of, but the problem with malvertising is that kind of went down. I mean, nobody uses Flash and like Java anymore, right? And as browser plugins, and those were usually the ones like Flash, PDF, and Java that were usually exploitable and easily exploitable. Browser vendors in general put like an insane amount of effort into like securing the browser as like an infection vector, and like their work kind of paid off. So like exploit kits aren't really a thing anymore. I mean, they still exist, and sometimes you have like a couple of infections, but it's like kind of rare. So malvertising is a vector, but it's no longer like the huge vector it used to be.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, sorry.
Well, I have a question about this from from recent experience. Someone who will go unnamed, who uses Chrome, not myself, called me in a panic because her computer was saying, "You've been infected. Call Windows."
Tech support scams, yeah.
Yeah, and it was some site that she went to, and so I don't know if, but obviously it's Chrome. Nope, and it was saying Windows, so I'm like, you're not infected because you're not even running Windows, but it still freaked her out, and she called the number and then hung up.
Yeah, like tech support scams are insane, and they usually prey on like users who aren't very familiar, especially elderly people. And the way like this works is you call them, you get like redirected to like a call center in India usually, and then they will request remote access to your system. And yeah, then they will show you like very scary looking entries in your event log, or they will do like some kind of bullshit on the command line that prints out an error, and they tell you like something is wrong with your system, and then they will try to sell you like a very expensive subscription. So
so yeah, it was just like I said, recent experience with an acquaintance. And we'll leave it at that.
It happens a lot, and I regularly get very angry like when I hear like from some of the victims, because obviously there's also like this entire component with like credit card fraud and stealing identities, because they have like all your information at that point, right? So it's like quite disgusting, to be honest, but it's a thing. It's a thing, unfortunately.
Cool. And Linda pointed out ad guards can prevent that.
Most ad blockers can, by the way. And like ad blockers, honestly, at this point, they are like your first line of defense when it comes to here on the internet. Like I personally don't use AdGuard. I prefer uBlock, but like AdGuard is pretty good as well. So as long as you use like some form of ad blocker, it's like a good idea to use it, to be honest.
Okay. So we're a little over. I have time, and Fabian, I think you said you have time after this as well.
Yeah, sure.
So we still have plenty of people who.
Half an hour I still have.
Okay, so we still have time for questions if anybody has them.
If not, I can just ramble about like recent experiences where MSPs got hit.
Go ahead.
I mean, yeah, uBlock Origin. Don't use like the normal uBlock. Use uBlock Origin, because there's like this entire drama going on between like the old owner
Okay.
But yeah, so a couple of things that you as an MSP should be aware if you ever get hit by ransomware, which I hope you don't. But in general, ransomware authors, or like most of these groups, they will hit over the weekend. There's like a method to their madness almost. It's not random that they hit you over the weekend. There's like the entire work week ahead, where like all your clients will call you constantly about their systems being encrypted. So yeah, if you ever get hit by it, you will probably be woken up like Monday morning from probably like a couple of dozen, if not like hundreds of clients calling you. It's also quite common that ransomware authors who target MSP specifically will refuse to negotiate with any of the affected clients and will only negotiate with you, the MSP. And the reason behind that is quite simple. If they would negotiate with the clients, then the clients would stop calling you. And they want to call you because they want you to be under like very, very high pressure. And this also has like a different effect. If you can't pay the ransom, or if like you as an MSP, you just default and go bankrupt, for example, or you just close down your company, then like all your clients will not get their data back because your clients won't be able to negotiate for their data. That is one of the reasons why I think that if you're an MSP, cyber insurance is almost a requirement for your kind of business. So you won't be responsible, or like it won't be your fault that if for some reason you get compromised and like all your clients get hit by ransomware. No, use uBlock, Origin instead of uBlock. Don't use uBlock, sorry. So yeah, it won't be your fault that like all your clients lose all your data just because you can't pay like the 5 million ransom that the ransomware authors will ask for. What I've also seen happening, by the way, is that like if you have like a very, very wealthy client, that they will actually pay for the ransom for you just because they need their data back, and like all your other clients getting the data back is kind of an added benefit, so to say, but don't kind of count on it, right? It's better to just have like cyber insurance and to like apply all these recommendations and guidelines that we mentioned before to avoid you getting it in the first place.
Yeah, just real quick on cyber insurance, because you mentioned it a couple of times. It might prevent you from going broke, but you mentioned earlier, if all your customers get hit, you're probably going to lose 70 to 80% of them anyway.
Yeah.
So there's a good chance you're going to go out of business, but with cyber insurance, does it protect you at least financially?
Yes.
Most of them?
So they will usually like they will usually pay the ransom for you, so at least like your clients get the data back, and you won't be completely covered with lawsuits afterwards, right? So I mean, even just because you went out of business doesn't mean that they like all the clients won't try to come after you afterwards, right?
Well, yeah,
so,
definitely. Yeah.
There's like that added bonus to that. So
especially here in the US, we're a little bit litigious.
Yes, so. Yes. You guys tend to be.
Okay. I don't see any more questions.
Yeah.
You know, we can probably go ahead and wrap this up. Again, everyone, thanks for sticking on here even after the hour. We still got quite a few people on here. You know, once again, have the recording out, and we'll. Oh wait, there's one last question coming in here. So if you still have copies of encrypted files long after the infection, is it still possible to decrypt them? You
Yes,
did say the notes may contain the keys, but is there still cases?
Yes, and that actually happens quite often. This is also like if you kind of if you got hit by ransomware, but you don't necessarily need your data and you can wait for it, kind of like it would be nice to get the data back, but I don't necessarily need it, so you don't pay the ransom, right? It may make sense for you to just store the encrypted data on like a drive somewhere, because there have been like plenty of cases where eventually like law enforcement agencies kind of caught the ransomware authors, or like their command and control server was found. So like somehow we got access to all the keys. So you get back the data later.
Okay.
And like decryption becomes possible later, even without paying the ransom. So it's like a good idea. And thank you very much for that question, Jeremy, because it's something I completely forgot about.
Cool.
But to be fair, this is usually something that more applies to home users, because like companies usually need their data.
Yeah.
But for home users in particular, if like your pictures of like your children or like old family videos got encrypted, it's probably a good idea to just store them somewhere just in case, like a ways being found to decrypt them later. And
Yeah, in a
cases,
you know, like on a portable hard drive that says "Do not attach to any computer," right?
Yeah, kind of, yes. I mean, storage is quite cheap nowadays, right? So just having like a copy laying around somewhere is usually not a big issue.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Fabian, thanks again. And thanks to the audience for attending. And everyone have a great day.
Yeah, my pleasure, really. Thank you very much for having me.
All right.